All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here, Commissioner.
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everyone.
It's just been a week, just over a week, since we all came back from Belém in Brazil, from COP30. And if I remember right, you had to dash for your plane. So I thought we'd start by having a bit of a COP30 debrief here. And especially since it was quite a dramatic last few days for the EU. You were very strongly opposed to a draft final agreement over weak language on climate action and some financial issues, and that led to overnight negotiations where you won some concessions in the end. And I was wondering if you can give us some details on those last-minute talks, if there was a turning point that made it all come together.
Well, it was certainly not easy. I'm the first to acknowledge that. At the same time, I'm slightly more positive than the summary you just gave. But what is true is that in that last night, we've also made clear, and we with the Europeans, Great Britain, Australia and others, that if there was not a minimum level of achievement, both on the side of mitigation and on the side of adaptation, that we would then be willing to also consider the alternative, which would be a no-deal scenario. And I mean, when that started to sink in, that also created realism in the conversation around the table that something really had to happen. And again, as I've said at that table, but also many times in the media, we were not doing this just for the sake of the Europeans or Great Britain or the Australians or others. There is a clear imperative to make sure we move the needle in terms of mitigation, and that was why we put this up in that last night as well.
Okay, but the EU overall didn't leave Belém fully happy, right?
Well, happiness is always hard to be found in multilateralism, is my experience. So it depends a bit where you put your bar.
Sure, but you wanted more, right? And I was wondering, I mean, what stopped you from trying to get more? You were trying to build a coalition that didn't quite succeed in making it large enough. Like, what was the obstacle?
I still get it, and that is also your role in life, that you're slightly less optimistic about these things than I am, and of course you're fully justified to be critical to anyone who comes home from whatever type of conference. But let's also face the reality that we have in front of us. We have a hugely complicated geopolitical situation. We have many actors around the table who actively and quite openly oppose more climate measures, certainly in the domain of mitigation and to a large degree also adaptation. And we're not talking about one or two. Many of you have actually reported on that there was a group of roughly 80 countries opposing more references to, for example, the phase out of fossil fuels. That is just a reality of the world. So again, it's of course perfectly fine to then be critical about the European Union and others in both the developed and developed world and saying, oh, why didn't you get more? Well, the name of the game of the whole COP is that you do this with complete consensus. So if those are the rules, and then you have such a large constituency that actually wants to go in a different direction, that basically limits the parameters of success. So the way I would summarize it is that yes, more would have been better, but we did manage to make or to take important steps forward, both in the domain of mitigation, but in particular also in the domain of adaptation finance, which is hugely important, particularly for those most in need. Think about the islands in the Pacific, think about the islands in the Caribbean, and think about also the LDCs.
You were quite critical of China in the run-up to COP30, their new climate target in particular. And then at COP30, a lot of countries, emerging economies, developing countries like Brazil say, but China is what makes our transition possible. Like they're lowering the cost for all of this clean technology. So I guess my question is twofold. I mean, is China a climate leader? And does it require you recognizing that to work with them?
So we have had a range of interactions with China also at the COP. I think we have had 3, 4 longer conversations, both at a political level and at an expert level. And one of the things that united us at the COP is that we wanted to make sure the bar would go up. And on balance, we were in favor of leaving Belém with an agreement, rather than no agreement. And that is something which the Chinese interlocutor and myself have also expressed numerous times to others. And then actually it helps to team up. What I've always said, and what I would happily repeat here, is that if you look at the whole set of accomplishments of China, you have just to acknowledge, and it is a factual statement, that has pluses and minuses, that is a mixed bag. And indeed, it is true that if you look at the electrification that is going on in China, that is hugely impressive. And if you are not in Beijing every single year, like myself, but frequently, and you compare it to 20 years ago or even to 5 years ago, and you look at what happened to the quality of the air, to the cars that drive around there, to how they are, by the way, also experimenting with autonomous driving, it is hugely impressive, and that is something you have to acknowledge. At the same time, and again, that is also just factual, China has committed itself to build tens and tens and tens of new coal plants. And we've had that conversation many times with them. They then come up with the narrative that this is a backup facility and that they just need that as, let's say, a security guarantee. And then my response to that is, well, if you start to build these things and you equip the people that work in that, in these plants, you train them, you equip them, you take them out of other jobs, is it really likely that you will not run these plants? I think it's not very likely. And clearly that has ramifications for climate action, right? So I think it is, given that we're so critical about the use of coal, it is also fair to acknowledge and to express our concerns to them about the fact that they're going to build new coal plants. And a similar conversation is the case with the NDCs. And again, it's not me talking, but most scientists had hoped for a Chinese NDC somewhere in the 30s. Some would say, well, maybe in the high 20s. And then the NDC that they came up with is roughly around 10%. And that has huge ramifications for all other nations, for the simple reason that China is responsible for 30% of global emissions. So all these elements, the pluses, the minuses, the things you are concerned about, the things you find deeply impressive, need to be part of the discourse, need to be part of the conversation we're having them. But once again, at COP, we did manage to team up with them to a significant degree.
Another thing that put the spotlight on the EU at COP30 was the question of trade, which kind of became a bit of a just code for CBAM for a lot of countries. And the conference ended with an agreement to keep discussing these measures. I was wondering, how are you going to manage these tensions around CBAM? You're about to propose measures to strengthen it further in the coming years.
To be honest, the holy fire was not truly there anymore. So yes, it was brought up a number of times. But if I just take the press conferences where we were present this year, and I compare them with last year. Last year, you might recall that the first press conference was almost 60% of all questions were about CBAM. And some would argue that this was, to at least some degree, this was because people had been pushing for this. And clearly it is a tool that is being used, as quite often is the case in diplomacy. So I immediately acknowledge that. But of course, I'm also having these conversations with many of these countries behind closed doors. And then they do quite often openly acknowledge that they see that the value, for frankly speaking, each country is relatively small. It's certainly always very small compared to the overall trade volume. They also recognize and acknowledge that maybe even though they don't really like it, they understand that the only thing we're doing is leveling the playing field within the European Union. So we're not asking a single thing more from a single company from all over the globe that we're not asking at the same time from the Europeans. And it's hard to argue that that is deeply unfair, right? So, in my view, we've seen, and we're behind the period of the most intensive conversations on this. At the same time, it will not die out completely over the course of the next few months, I think. But next year, my guess is it will be less than this COP.
Are you going to hold firm on other green measures affecting trade? Because you've come under pressure, for example, from the US and Qatar over the methane emission limits. I mean, are you considering weakening them, or can we expect you to hold fast?
Overall, with all these things, and also with CBAM, there has been a clear logic to come up with them, and we've truly structured these things in a way that is balanced, in a way that is fair, in a way that also allows us to have a conversation on this. And just one more time back to CBAM. One of the things we're seeing is that CBAM actually has a significant anticipation effect. And that maybe even, and in some cases, even those who might have expressed their concerns publicly are not only acknowledging inside of a room that actually the effects are not that large, they're actually even saying that it helps them to have a different type of conversation. And we're not doing this, again, for ourselves. We're doing this to make sure that together we move the needle as much as possible in the domain of climate action. Because let's not forget, we're looking ahead of tens and tens and tens of billions of euros in terms of damages, more in the future than we're already having today.
Yeah. Just as a final question, because I know you have to dash, we'll talk more about this in our next panel, but after finally agreeing the 2040 target, the Commission will now work on how measures to achieve it, right? Over the next year. And you've pushed for a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels at COP30. Can you give us a little preview of what that roadmap will look like for the EU after 2030?
So, frankly speaking, that roadmap is to a large degree already there and concrete towards 2030, right? Because if you are pushing out 55% of your emissions, that means that has huge ramifications for your use of fossil. And of course, in Europe, we are replacing that at considerable speed with renewables. And that transition will only continue and accelerate, frankly speaking, between 2030 and 2040. And that is, I think, one of the big misconceptions. And there's always a lot of talk about backlash and what is simplification doing? And my answer quite often is, let's just look at the numbers. Let's look at what Europe is doing between 2020 and 2030 and compare what we plan to do between 2030 and 2040. And everyone who has been in math class will acknowledge that that is actually an acceleration rather than a downgrade of what we are having today. It's not going to be easy. And we'll need to find a recipe, and I've been saying that over and over again, where we really make sure that climate competitiveness and independence are being brought together. That, in the end, is the winning formula. That is the thing that Europe should absolutely have. Never again one at the expense of the other. So it's not easy, but it is doable, and it is something we will deliver on, starting already, of course, in this period as a Commission.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us here, Commissioner.
Thank you, and thank you all.
And now, as we leave the stage... Thank you. Thank you. I'll just ask you all to stay seated, please, for a panel on what's next in the EU's climate policy framework, as we just heard a tease of, moderated by my colleague Louise Guillot. Thank you.